much for joining us again in another essay discussion. Today is one of the earliest ones by Rand, The Only Path of Tomorrow. So, James, I was wondering if you could drive us through telling us a bit on the political and biographical context of this essay.
Well, this essay was published in January 1944, in the first edition in 1944 of the famous Reader's Digest magazine. For many, many years, it's still an important publication. For many decades, it was the biggest selling commercial magazine in the United States. And it was, I think, only in the 21st century was it beat out by Better Homes and Gardens. So it's a very standard publication. They were famous for doing condensations of other books. For example, they did a condensation just a couple of years after this of Hayek's Road to Serfdom. Incidentally, they were a right of center, a conservative publication. And especially after the war, after these events, they became even more ferociously anti-communist as the years went by. So it's a relatively conservative publication that Ayn Rand was published in, and a very, very popular one. I mean, it was in the homes of literally millions of Americans at the time. I remember our house had a subscription, just like National Geographic or something. It was a standard thing. In Ayn Rand's own biography, it's important to note that this was published 10 years after her first novel, We the Living, her depiction of the grim realities of Soviet totalitarianism from her own perspective, even. After Anthem, after the night of January 16th, it had its successful run on Broadway, and just after The Fountainhead. Ayn Rand had delivered her manuscript to The Fountainhead on December 31st, 1942. It was released by Bobbs Merrill, the publisher, in May of 1943. And so this is January of 1944. And in the intervening months, she sold the movie rights to The Fountainhead and was on her way to moving back from New York to Hollywood so that she could complete the screenplay for The Fountainhead. In the months that followed this in 1944, January 1944, we're still in the midst of World War II. Hitler and Stalin are still very much in power. This was published 6 months before the Allied invasion of Normandy in France, 6 months before D-Day. So Hitler and Stalin were still very much in power and global threats to the world when she's writing. 1944 would see Ayn Rand, her move to Hollywood. She would sign a contract to be a screenwriter with the famous Hal Wallace, the guy that produced Casablanca. She would write the screenplay to Love Letters in the following year, but she had not yet developed her theory of concepts, for example. What's astonishing to me in this article, and this will be my last comment, is how perfectly consistent with her later philosophical ideas this article is, even though she hasn't fully developed all of her ideas yet. Like The Fountainhead, it is perfectly consistent with her later philosophy. She's just working out the further details in her formulations in Atlas Shrugged, in her development of her theory of concept formation. And so forth. So we're catching Ayn Rand here in midstream in the development of her ideas, but it's perfectly consistent with her later mature ideas. She had not yet, I take it back, one more comment. It was right about this point where she undertook to write her first nonfiction book. It was tentatively to be titled The Moral Basis of Individualism. And this essay, I think, is part of her work in outlining and writing the first draft of that. She abandoned that to focus on Atlas Shrugged because she wanted to live in the world. She was a novelist who wanted to live in the world and concretize the reality of her philosophy. And so at this point, the idea of writing a whole nonfiction philosophical treatise just wasn't as interesting to her as it would later be. Now that's interesting because she would later describe nonfiction as easy compared to writing fiction. She said it was killingly difficult to write novels. So here she is, she's choosing to do a more difficult thing by preference, Atlas Shrugged over a nonfiction treatment. But this essay is sort of a piece of that nonfiction treatment as she was developing it, if that makes sense.
And this book is what later became the textbook of Americanism,
That's a separate. She wrote for in the wake of the war, a few years after this, when the Iron Curtain fell, and so there was a large anti-communist movement. And people in America were very concerned about communist. A well-known period of time in the late 40s and 50s, where Americans were very concerned about communist infiltration of ideas into culture. And there, she was writing in effect, material to combat. In effect, communist ideas that were infiltrating American culture. But they are closely related. Again, not the same text, but very closely related as a statement of her ideas at that moment in time. The 1940s saw most of objectivism being developed. And so when this was published in 1944, through the rest of the 40s, she would be developing her theory of concept formation. She would be outlining Atlas Shrugged. And so important work in the development of objectivism is happening right now in the 1940s.
Yes, wasn't it these discussions with this priest delved in the conception of concepts? Wasn't it right after the end of writing the Fountainhead?
It was pretty close to writing. It was about at this time, but shortly thereafter. I think it was in the next year or two, literally from writing this article, that Ayn Rand would have the insight about measurement, omission, unit economy, and the function and role of concepts.
So, talking about more specifically about this essay, could you drive us about? Would you tell us a bit more about what is the essence of what she's trying to say here?
Well, America was, and the West was, civilization was evolved in one of the great conflicts of civilization that Western civilization has ever known and experienced. We were in the midst of World War II. And so her focus here is on the threat of totalitarianism, and how totalitarianism at that moment was the urgent threat to the world. And so it was. And so what she's trying to get at is the underlying philosophy behind totalitarianism, collectivism, and stressing the ideas that are common to both communism and Nazism and other forms of collectivism, and how the opposite philosophy, a philosophy of individualism, is really the only path to a civilized future. And hence the title, The Only Path to Tomorrow. She's saying individualism is really the only path to progress, to a future, to the development of mankind. The collectivism represents the primordial voice of dictatorship, tribalism, and the past.
And why does she consider that totalitarian philosophy more than the totalitarian movements or the threat to civilization?
Well, ultimately, that is the goal of collectivism, and ultimately, in effect, implicitly, even altruism. The subordination of the individual, the demand that he sacrifice for the greater good. She saw that as the common thread, the underlying thread behind totalitarianism, and the impact of totalitarianism she saw as nothing but destruction and slavery, as events proved, as history proved. I mean, people weren't aware of all the details of Stalin's nightmare in his reign of terror, and people were, in 1944 in the West, not really even apprised of what was going on during the Holocaust in Germany. So even before there was a general knowledge about the horrors of the West, Ayn Rand understood that those horrors must inherently be a part of totalitarianism, the destruction of human happiness, life, and survival, ultimately.
And there's also another interesting comment from her, and that's that the best allies of this kind of totalitarian philosophy are the people's confusion rather than people advocating for this philosophy. Why does she consider that to be the case?
You know, collectivism and totalitarianism put on a nice smiley face. They put on the lipstick and smile at us, don't they, with the ideas that might sound friendly, like the common good or the public welfare or the interests of the poor. And so they put it in terms of, values that people, would generally ascribe to. Yeah, who doesn't want, Who wants poverty? Who wants suffering? Who doesn't want most people to be better off and there to be general prosperity? And so when you talk about the common good, it can be utterly misleading. But the very point of the common good, as opposed to the individual, I mean, we wouldn't need the common good if you didn't think there was a conflict somehow between the individual's interests and the collective interest, the group's interest. Ayn Rand sees that conflict as completely unnecessary, and that whole promotion of this idea of the common good or the public good as being hostile to the interests of the individual. That's the only purpose for the concept, to subordinate the individual.
Could you comment on the notion of the common good, maybe from the perspective of someone that maybe hasn't heard the objections that objectivism has against it?
Ayn Rand has a lovely image here, I think. She points out that a healthy forest can be comprised of rotten trees. When you conceptually separate the group from what the group really is, a collection of specific individuals, and you tell me that the interests of those specific individuals all have to be sacrificed for this abstract common good, it's like a religious concept. It's like God or ghost or something. It's some mystical concept, the way they treat it, because it's in conflict by necessity. If you say the common good has to take superiority over the individual good, then what you've necessarily done is created this sort of smiley face excuse saying, oh, well, of course, it's the common good that we're after, while in the meantime, you're crushing the actual good of all the actual individuals who are the only thing that comprises this society. So there can be no such conflict. If you think about it, a healthy forest implies healthy individual trees.
And why has it been the case that most totalitarian people have used the common good as a justification? Why don't they use the idea of individual rights as their main bastion to get themselves into power?
Individual rights is the enemy of any collectivism, any totalitarianism. It is precisely what totalitarianism is the approach to government that is, and as the name implies, it's sort of total government or total control. It controls both the thinking and acting, the mind and the body. And so your freedom of thought and expression, censorship, and usually a common ideology that the collectivist state, the totalitarian state is putting forth, communism, Nazism, you name it. This ideology sort of is what's going to be forced on people, but also in their action, in their private lives, so that their economic business and their freedom to act and their private property. So totalitarianism is characterized by both intense censorship and an official doctrine, as well as the control over people's practical lives, and that usually means complete socialism and a command economy. That's totalitarianism. Collectivism is the philosophy that underlies that, the idea that the individual must subordinate himself and his interests to the good of the collective. That is at odds with individual rights inherently. And individual rights are exactly the thing that would undermine and make impossible this notion of complete socialism and total censorship. Individual rights is the enemy of censorship. Individual rights is the enemy of individual freedom of action. And that's what Ayn Rand is talking about.
But didn't Napoleon was more or less did he have tinges or some sort of some of his policies were more pro-individual rights than his predecessors?
Well, he made himself, it was when he first started out, Napoleon was an advocate of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and he turned into an emperor, a dictator who made the Pope coronate him emperor of France and ruler of Europe in effect. And so his ambitions went beyond, sure, the French Revolution was a mixed bag of ideas, and part of the mixed bag was the initiation of Napoleon. But when he took power, he had no problem invading countries. He had no problem trying to take over the whole of Europe and to impose on Europe a single legal system that he thought, anywhere where he had real power, he was going to impose a single ideology, a single legal system, in some ways critical of religion, that's true, or at least traditional religion, that's true, a more civil, in his mind, maybe a more enlightened view, but it was still And while it's not what we call 20th century totalitarianism, he lacked the technology, he lacked the ideology, but it wasn't for lack of intention. I think Napoleon wanted to be the dictator of Europe and wanted to revolutionize it with his ideology that he would jam down the throats of Europe, which is really the essence of totalitarianism, isn't it?
And the classic history of Beethoven taking away the dedication to Napoleon in his Heroica.
Beethoven had some principle there, didn't he? Napoleon declares himself emperor, in effect, dictator of Europe, and Beethoven, who actually had some belief in liberty, changed his dedication to the Heroica Symphony. Yeah.
So let's turn to the other ideal. We mentioned collectivism, but now let's go to individualism. Could you tell us what is the basic tenet of individualism?
Ayn Rand in this article defines individualism as the belief that the individual is the important entity, an independent entity with inalienable rights, whose individual rights must be respected against other claims. So it is the doctrine that the individual is the important social unit. It is the idea that he is a sovereign being with inalienable rights, and that this implies that people should be treated, that individuals must be treated as equals in a system. And this is the part that was cut out, one of the parts that was cut out from her article by Reader's Digest, in a system of voluntary, unregulated exchange. So for her, individualism means individual freedom, based on the morality that the individual alone can produce his own happiness.
She also has a very interesting way of framing two basic rights. She mentions the right to liberty and also mentions the right to pursuit of happiness. But in the right to liberty, she means the right to action, choice, and right to property. So why do you think that she framed the right to liberty in that way?
It has to include the freedom to think, which is where, and implicit. What's interesting here is that even though she hasn't fully developed objectivism here, it's still implicit. You have to be able to think independently on your own. All progress, all creativity depends on individual freedom, freedom to think, freedom to express, and freedom to act on those ideas. And without private property, you cannot engage. And this is one of the arguments she makes here, again, very briefly and efficiently, but in a way totally consistent with her later philosophy. It is the freedom to act on your independent judgment that is, if I can use the title of her previous, just published novel, the fountainhead of all human progress. And so for her, absent freedom of action, and this includes the freedom to own and dispose of your own property, the product of your own efforts, is absolutely essential to human progress. So both spiritual and material progress are hinge on individual freedom of action.
And the third part of the essay, she talks about the two main antagonists in history. Can you tell us which ones she considers these kind of characters are?
Well, she labels them here active man and passive man. And this really becomes the ultimate justification for individualism and freedom in her view. In history and human progress, as she looks through history, and she does go back, and Ayn Rand was a student of history, understood the history of Western civilization pretty well. And she understood that every moment of relative progress from the ancient world, for example, in ancient Rome or Greece, all the way through the Dark Ages is the opposite, and then the development of the modern world and individual rights in contrast to all that. She understands that history is liberating independent thinkers. It is a question of the independent thinker, the active man, who will act on his independent thought, bring it into reality as well. So it's the freedom to think and the freedom to act of these producers, the active man, the man who actively thinks and actively puts those thoughts into reality through his active production. All of human progress, development, whether it's spiritual, artistic, intellectual, or whether it's material and economic, depends upon the freedom of active man to think and act and produce independently. And it is the whole history, in effect, of she is echoing, in effect, Lord Acton. The whole history of civilization is really a history of individual liberty in her mind. And progress happens when the individual is free, because active man, the independent thinker, the independent actor, is free to produce, is free to think. Whereas the passive man is the guy who is not confident in his own ability to reason, not confident in his own ability to survive. He is, in effect, in need. He wants the security of the group. He needs to merge with some tribe. And it doesn't matter whether it's his race, whether it's his social class. See, both Nazism and communism are implicitly attacked here. It doesn't matter whether it's his race, his social class, or some other tribalistic category we put him into. They're trying to merge with a group out of insecurity. The passive man is not really in control of his life. Starts mentally, because he's not an independent thinker, and existentially. He fears that he cannot support his own life, even if he, isn't a disabled person or something. Therefore, he needs the security of others. He needs to harness, in effect, the energy of the active man. And to do that, he needs collectivism. He needs the idea that this individual, the active man, his interests must be subordinated to all of our needs and our interests. And so the passive man is the advocate of collectivism by psychological and existential necessity. And so the basic conflict of civilization is the conflict between the passive man who wants to rule the producer and the active man whose basic social requirement is freedom. Freedom to come up with new ideas, freedom to act on his new ideas, whatever other people think, so long as he doesn't violate their rights, so long as it is voluntary free exchange.
And how do you integrate this set of people with what we discussed a couple of essays ago with the Attila and the witch doctor? Would you think that these are subsets of the passive people, or would they be a third kind of archetype?
Both subsets of the passive. Both see, and Ayn Rand would develop it in greater detail. Since the mystics of muscle and the mystics of mind have both rejected reason, they must perforce be passive man. They're different varieties. And Ayn Rand implicitly suggests that when she says there's passivity in thought as well as passivity in action. She'll just develop that further with Attila and the witch doctor, breaking down the kinds of passive man that there can be. But both of them, in effect, by abandoning reason, are passive man. They cannot be active, independent, creative thinkers, and therefore they must feel out of control of their life and in need of harnessing someone else. The mystic, your witch doctor, needs to harness the Attila, and the Attila needs to harness sort of the witch doctor, and there needs to be this unholy alliance between the two to really sort of function since they've abandoned reason.
And what do you think about these people who recognize the existence of the active people, and they think that they should chain them to support the passive people? What do you think should be said for them or against them?
Oh, wow. What can you say about people who try to rule other people may not sound like they're passive man, may not sound passive at all. Hitler, Stalin, boy, they were active, energetic people who rose to the top of their governments and societies. But really, they are just as passive as any of the other passive men. They are seeking to rule by exploitation. They're seeking to exist by parasitism. They need to enslave their populations. They need to engage in international warfare. They are dependents just as much as any other passive man, however active they may seem. The truly active man is the independent thinker, the man willing to courageously act on his independent judgment. And so, yeah, they're aware of the need to harness these people. Even your Hitlers and Stalins are aware of the need to enslave and harness and get people on their side to do it willingly. As Ayn Rand points out, no dictator can really stay in power simply by force of arms. It is by ideological means, spiritual means, that they're disarmed. This moral high ground that altruism takes, this common good talk, this sacrifice for the German nation or sacrifice for the proletariat, these big noble sounding ideas, they're all giant justifications for enslaving the producer, the thinker, the active man, the fountainhead.
And why I think one of the most interesting statements in the whole essay is that she considers that civilizations fall because of a very particular case. Could you guide us which one Rand think it is?
Well, if human civilization and progress depends upon independent thought and acting on independent thought, these active men, these producers, if it is the productive human being that civilization and progress simply depends upon, and I mean fully depends upon, that is the survival of all of us, literally, our well-being depends upon the production and thought of active man. And therefore, the rise and fall of civilizations depends upon the comparative freedom given to active man. His freedom of action is precisely what the rise and fall of civilizations depends upon. When independent thought has been chained, just as Christianity did at the end of classical civilization, that will bring upon us a dark age by necessity, because what they have done is limited the freedom of active man. And so civilizations fall and rise depending on the degree of freedom to which independent thought and action are allowed in that society.
Do you think that this idea could explain why the Bronze Age collapsed, or we cannot use this kind of idea?
When we go into prehistory, when we go into the prehistoric world, when we get into the second millennia BC, it gets harder to understand. It is, in my view, there are comparative things you can say, even in that context, right? That, for example, the comparative independence, say, of Minoan or Mycenaean civilization gave it a relative freedom against the older, bigger, monolithic civilizations of Pharaonic Egypt or the Assyrians or the Hittites or something. And so I think that can explain certain developments, for example, in the Minoan advances in Minoan civilization. But real advances in civilization really didn't begin until in the late Bronze Age, when human beings started writing down again and being literate, and Greek civilization got going. But once again, it was the comparative independence of the Greek, and maybe for geological as well as geographical regions, they had relative freedom and independence both from one another and from these large empires, which gave them a certain intellectual freedom as well. You could go that far back, but the really good examples are in modern times, right? And in the last 200 or 300 years, all you have to do is look to the degree that a culture has experienced freedom. Individual freedom is the precise measure of the general prosperity of that and vibrancy of that culture.
Take a look at Argentina.
The examples are endless, aren't they?
Yes, there are many.
I mean, look at
many
Venezuela.
examples.
Look at, recently, look at the horrors that Venezuela has just gone through, down to starvation, where they're eating the pets, and eating dog food just to survive. How many lessons does humanity have to go through painfully to learn this lesson, that freedom is the basic social condition for human progress and prosperity?
Well, let's move to something a bit more with a better perspective, and I think this connects to a comment that Robert made at the beginning of the discussion. He says that this is an excellent discussion. Politics matters, but it's the result of the cause, the crucial philosophical, the cause or philosophical issues. With that being said, could you tell us what are the two paths of tomorrow, the two paths that we can take, according to Ayn Rand in this article?
Well, as she points out, in her time, people like communists were saying the future belongs to the collectivist. The new idea is collectivism. as if this was the new scientific, state-of-the-art sort of modern progressive idea, and that only by adopting communism can we really have a technologically innovative or a culturally innovative society, which is what the Marxists actually were claiming. She's saying, no, no, no. All these varieties of collectivism are the same old dark age, feudal, absolute monarch, tribal leader, collectivist ideas of the primordial past. The only alternative is individualism, individual rights respected as absolutes, where persons, she boils it down to this: human happiness cannot be achieved collectively. Human happiness has to be determined on an individual level. If someone were to tell you that, no, you can't be a medical doctor, a physician, but you have to go argue for a living like a lawyer, you turn someone into a miserable person and probably not a very good lawyer. If someone told you this is who you have to love, these have to be your friends, this has to be your romantic partner, that's a formula for absolute misery. If someone told you this has to be your taste in art, it'd be a formula. No. Only individuals can determine their values, and only by the pursuit of individually believed in and determined values can people even achieve happiness. Happiness cannot be achieved collectively. It can only be achieved by considering the individual the essential unit here. And so there's really only one path to the future, one path to intellectual and material progress, and that is the freedom of the individual.
And well, thank you very much for this, James. But I think another way that we can see this essay is also distinguishing her ideas in the 1940s against the 1960s and 70s. And as you said, she already has most of her philosophy worked out to some extent. Do you think that there are any other ideas that we're going to boil up later that she doesn't have completely on spot, aside of the theory concept that we already mentioned?
Well, it's the implications, I think, of her theory. When she was writing her, as I say, this essay is sort of a piece from that moment when she's trying to write her first nonfiction book on philosophy, The Moral Basis of Individualism. And when you read that book, part of the reason, she says, I want to do it in fiction. That's her personal selfish motive. But part of the reason is she realized that these ethical and political issues really can't be decided without a deeper appreciation of epistemology. So it was at this very moment that she was going deeper into the epistemological roots of individualism, the epistemological basis for her ethics. And it is, when you understand her mature ethics, you have to understand, right, the trichotomy: intrinsicism, Kantian or religious ethics; subjectivism, these, modern consequentialist views of ethics, right? Pragmatism or utilitarianism or something. And so she, to really understand the point that she's getting at here, she has to draw out an epistemological issue that she hasn't fully developed yet, this objective versus subjective intrinsic trichotomy. And that, I think, is the single most important thing that she has yet to work out. But she knew that she also had to work out epistemology in general to really justify and get to the roots of what are, in effect, the basic moral and political ideas, which are almost fully explained here. There are certain formulations. I mean, not only the late 40s, but also the period of time at the end of writing Atlas Shrugged, when she was doing Galt's speech, that she came up with some of her specific formulations that were so important. And it's these two periods, the mid to late 40s and that period of time when she was actually composing Galt's speech, that I think are the two most important moments in putting the final touches on objectivism to make it the complete system that we know it as.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Now, I think there's another issue that we could talk that is not specifically about the essay, but it's also about Rand's diatribes with the editor. And Tom Bowden made an article on that about 2 years ago, published on ARI. Could you comment a bit more on that?
Oh, Tom does an amazing job. Yeah, Tom works for the Ayn Rand Institute, and a couple of years ago on the Ayn Rand Institute website, he published an excellent short essay on Ayn Rand as an editor of, and Ayn Rand was an extremely demanding editor of herself. She demanded legal precision, like a legal document, she would say. And she was the hard part for her was to forestall any implication that she was saying something that she wasn't saying. Or she wanted to avoid all that because she knew how the false alternatives that others had had. And she wanted to avoid those pitfalls. And there were four key differences. Now, the unfortunate thing is, when she submitted it, it was accepted, but she wrote a letter back saying that there were at least four important changes that they had made, that she wanted to go back to her original draft in the manuscript, and she had reasons for them, good reasons for them. Unfortunately, the letter did not get to the editors of Reader's Digest in time. And so the version that came out in January of 1944 is inferior, and in some ways pulled important teeth. And that's the way she later described it in a letter to a friend. They pulled the teeth from my article. In some ways, they did pull important teeth. For example, and this is one of the important examples, in listing previous totalitarians and forerunners to totalitarianism, she lists Napoleon, and then she lists Hitler, and she lists in her original draft Stalin. Well, this is 1944. The Allies are allied with Stalin and the Soviet Union. And in the United States, anyone who was critical of Russia was considered pro-Hitler. And if you said a negative thing about Stalin, General Patton got in trouble for saying negative things about Russia at the end of World War II, because they're our allies, don't you know? And how dare you say anything bad about Uncle Joe? Uncle Joe, that was literally the attitude in the United States, that you got to be on Stalin's side, as opposed to Ayn Rand did not see the difference between Hitler and Stalin. Now, she did say in her letter, look, you may regard it as inadvisable, that was her word, inadvisable at this time to attack Stalin, since we're still in the midst of war, but then eliminate the whole list. Don't include just Hitler and leave out Stalin, because that implies that we're saying Stalin is not a totalitarian, when he was. So she said, either keep the list and include Stalin, but if you think it's politically inadvisable in the middle of our war against Hitler, leave out the whole list, because that would imply Stalin's not a totalitarian dictator. So in Ayn Rand's mind, there's, now implicitly they left certain ideas. Like I say, Ayn Rand attacks both racism, all racism as such, as well as class distinctions for this, whatever the collectivist unit is. So implicitly, she's attacking both communism and Nazism in the article by the ideas, but they left out Stalin. Good up, and as I say, this was a right of center publication. These were moderate conservatives who were leaving out an explicit attack on Stalin in 1944. It is true that public awareness hadn't yet developed about Stalin being at least as bad as Hitler yet in people's minds. We didn't have Orwell or Solzhenitsyn or Pasternak or any of that yet. Ayn Rand was a prophet on this and was seeing things ahead of her time. But it's no excuse. Ayn Rand thought that there was really no conceptual distinction between totalitarian communism and totalitarian Nazism. Another important one, now, this is one of the more disturbing ones. She had said in her article that when active man is destroyed, passive man cannot survive. That was her original text. Cannot survive. It's simply a fact. If the thinker, if the independent producer, if active man is hobbled, chained, destroyed, unable to do his work, passive man will not survive. He cannot, by his nature, he's passive man. Reader's Digest is not happy with that. And they change it. Now get this. They change it to passive man can, quote, no longer be cared for. Ayn Rand says, wait a minute, that implies altruism. That implies that we all have a duty to care for every passive man who comes around. That's not my position. In fact, that's the position of the collectivists. No, what I'm saying is not something normative in that sense. I'm saying something factual. Without the freedom of active man, passive man will not survive. Get this. They took out, and this is critical, individuals must, quote, deal with one another as equals, she said. They end it right there. Well, she said, well, any communist might believe the same thing. We all have to treat, in some sense, each other in an egalitarian way. That's standard socialism and communism. The point I'm making was what they left out, and this was the key phrase: involuntary, unregulated exchange. I mean laissez-faire capitalism. And so they cut that out. And again, this is a right-of-center publication who's cutting Ayn Rand out on the need for voluntary and unregulated exchange, which was really the essence of her point, the real difference between socialists and communists and her. And then finally, they left out the scare quotes, this is astonishing, from The Common Good. They kept them in some places, but they took them out in the most critical point, when Ayn Rand is saying that when the common good is thought superior to individual rights, that's the destruction of active man's capacity. They replace it with the abolition of individual rights. And so she points out that what you're saying is that you're implying that I would believe individual rights could be abrogated if it helped the common good. But that's exactly my point. I'm saying there is no conflict between the actual common good and the individual good, which is what you've smuggled back into my article. So in a letter to Leonard Read shortly after this, Ayn Rand did, as I say, complain that they basically pulled some of the important teeth in the published version of this. And in later discussions, she really didn't rip on Reader's Digest. It was mostly consistent with her ideas and even her later ideas. But boy, they watered it down to the point that, even a mild moderate might accept. And I think that's what Reader's Digest had in mind. They didn't realize the philosophically radical nature of Ayn Rand's argument, and that it was a moral argument for the politics of individualism. That's what they were missing.
When I was back in uni, the best professors that I had were very keen on having the right words to describe what you wanted. And I always liked that. And from this kind of experiences, and also from some anecdotes of Dr. Peikoff, I realized that Rand was very keen on having very particular wording of what she was saying. Maybe you could.
I really can think of no other writer whose work, and I have studied the lives of other writers, philosophers and fiction writers. In preparing my book, The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics, I had to make a sort of study of the way other writers and intellectuals in recent years have been discussed. And I can think of no other writer who was so rigorous, so exacting, so demanding of herself. There's a great line in The Fountainhead that Tom quotes, my mistakes end up in my rubbish bag. Thank you very much. And Ayn Rand was very much that way. She was, people think of her as an egoist, but she's not an egoist in this sense, a narcissist. She would say to her editors at every level, whether they were book publishers or magazine editors, whether it was the column for the LA Times or her essay here for Reader's Digest, if you have got a better suggestion, I will submit. It's the truth I'm after. I'm not in love with my own words. What I want to do is be as exact, precise, and avoid any misleading implications. And that's what gives Ayn Rand's, looking back, this is 1944. We're looking now at almost 80 years ago. This is 75 plus years ago. She wrote this, and it's still directly relevant to the issues of today. And the only way to achieve that is to be just as rigorous in your philosophical formulations as Ayn Rand was.
Indeed, very much.
Thank you.
Well, let me thank Jaime for his contribution, and Robert as well. So, James, is there anything else that you think that we should have discussed, but maybe I didn't ask?
No, I think we've covered it very, very well. What is astonishing, I just point out a couple of things. Ayn Rand is attacked from most of the attacks on Ayn Rand are vicious and dishonest, in my view. They're often personal in nature and inaccurately personal in nature, they're avoiding her ideas altogether. And one thing I would observe here, and it's just one little observation of many that could be made, but Ayn Rand was publishing against racism. I know in the context of totalitarianism here, but even before World War II, in the English first edition of Anthem, Ayn Rand is attacking racism in published works, both in the 1930s and in the mid-1940s. The context in America was Jim Crow, and segregation is still happening in America, especially the American South. The Brown versus Board of Education was ruled on in 1954, 10 years after this. 10 years after this, Ayn Rand is denouncing racism in published work, nonfiction and fiction, years before anyone has ever heard of Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, or the Civil Rights Movement, years before the Supreme Court has said separate but equal is unconstitutional. That's just one. Ayn Rand is putting, to take another example, Ayn Rand is putting Hitler and Stalin, communism and Nazism in the same exact boat before the anti-Stalinists would later come and talk about it in those terms. Before Orwell, the socialist Orwell, would make a similar complaint. Ayn Rand was ahead of the curve on all of these things and is never given credit for being one of the most innovative and important moral thinkers of the 20th century, way ahead of her time.
Very much indeed. And also, she was very keen on the idea of women being masters of their own lives. But that comes later.
Right. Oh, you could multiply the examples here from the Fountainhead or the Anthem or this article almost indefinitely, and you can see how the rest of objectivism really is spinning out either the epistemological premises or the policy conclusions from these ideas, these same ideas that you'll find in Anthem, the Fountainhead, and in this article, which are all perfectly consistent with her mature view, objectivism.
So, James, I cannot thank you enough for these talks. If you people in the audience enjoy as much this kind of discussions, please make a contribution to the Ayn Rand Center UK. Membership starts on £10 a month, and the perks for that are amazing. You get discussions with James every Sunday, talking about learner pickups courses, and the communication bootcamp with Don Watkins and several other more. Please don't miss that opportunity, and you help us a lot to continue these discussions.
Well, thank you. Yes, please, if you find these valuable, please hit like, subscribe, make comments, share it with your friends, and do consider becoming a paid subscriber. The Don Watkins Communication Bootcamp by itself is worth the £10 a month. I promise you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And see you next Tuesday.
Yes, take care.